Social perception, we left off doing the social identity wheel thing. So beyond that task, right? Situational information also affects our social perception, right? The situation we are in is going to influence how we behave. The people we're around is going to influence how we behave. So things like time, right? Time passes, older generations interpret certain things differently than newer generations. Right? So, older generations might still be like, if you have weirdly colored hair and you have tattoos and piercings, you're probably a criminal. It's like, not really, maybe they're just fun and people just like them. But obviously that creates an issue, that, different generations are gonna be like, it's really not a problem. So that obviously influences that. Beyond that, in terms of online versus offline personas, we live in a time where a lot of things online are very much fake, but weirdly enough, even if we know we're fake, they still bother us. There has been kind of a shift in an attempt to have more realistic portrayals online. But even then, right, the avatars or images that you choose to present, nobody's using their worst photo as a picture for anything unless you were dared to do so, or you lost a bet or something, right? We want to look our best when we're online. If you're using an avatar, you're not really using an image of yourself, right? You either it's meant to look like you, or you're using things that represent your personality, right? The type of music that you like, type of movies, etc. All of that would come into play, and then your username, right? Whether it's your actual name or it's reflective of again something else that you enjoy. We pick these carefully to kind of present a very specific image of who we are to the world. Obviously, the situations we're in, right? I don't speak to you guys the same way I talk to my friends or the same way I talk to my parents, and likewise, you don't speak to me the same way you speak to, your friends or your parents. So all of those things are always going to have an effect. Obviously, beyond that, right? You don't behave the same way you do when you're, going out with your friends than if you're going to a funeral. I mean, you could, but it would be pretty strange if you did so. Professionalism, so close, age, and experience, right? I have the very perpetual experience of constantly getting Phineas and Ferb and being asked, aren't you a little young to be a professor? I'm always like,
Ok, sí, o sea, si vas a iba a tener un salir muy poco, pues pueda hacer así. Pero no tengo me just saying, aren't you a little young? And that professor also being like, oh my God, how cute, you're so young. Thank you. Thank you so much. Right, for those things, right? A lot of times people associate age with experience, but that doesn't necessarily have to be true, right? Realistically, if there was a position open for a social media manager position, all of you would probably be significantly more qualified than like a 50-year-old because you all grew up with the internet all the time. So you're a lot more versed in all the social media things than somebody who's in their 50s. But obviously it's not going to reflect that way, right? People are still going to be like, well, you don't have work experience in this, or you're quite young, all of the stuff that does play a role. Clothes, obviously, I have my personal feelings about how I feel like clothes shouldn't reflect either your professionalism, but it does. Obviously, if I showed up here and taught you an entire class dressed as Spider-Man, it'd be pretty weird. I mean, I did do it one time for Halloween. It was fun. But still, I was very self-aware that it was an odd thing to do, and I had told my students I was going to do it, so they didn't walk into a classroom and go like, what is happening? Scripted interactions, right? We have interactions that we kind of know how they're supposed to go, right? You ask somebody how they're doing and you expect them to just say fine and move along. That's not always true, right? You might go to Burger King, you just want to get some lunch real quick. How you doing to the cashier, and then they tell you their whole life story, and you're like, I don't know how to get out of this conversation, and I don't want to be rude, but also I just want to eat, and I don't know why we're kind of going through this. Happens a lot as well with like older people. For example, before I was working here, I had a different job, and I would go to the supermarket that was next to my job to get food.
And one day I just see a lady struggling to like get un pote de avena down. And I'm just like, hi, ma'am, do you need help? I helped her. And then my entire lunch break was her just telling me about her kids, her grandkids, the husbands, all of these things. And I was just like, I don't know how to politely get out of this conversation. And I'm very, very happy that my boss does not care that much about when I clock in and when I clock out and when I actually take my break, because I just lost my entire break having a conversation with this lady. So that happens a lot. If you've ever taken, Urbano, fascinating things happen on there every day. Ubers, there's some Ubers that are super chill. There's some Ubers that you're like, man, that was a lot of information that I didn't need to know. Another example, this happened recently. I was going home in an Uber, and this lady is on the phone, just fine. But then, she's talking to her son's baseball coach about where this game is supposed to be. Whatever, normal enough. And then she's like, yeah, no, I can't go to that game. And I'm like, whatever, it's normal. And she's like, oh, no, don't you know, my other son was killed in front of that field. And I was like, ma'am, this is an Uber. And you just, I don't know, like I'm trying to make sure that my face isn't kind of demonstrating my reaction to everything. But people say the strangest thing. My final example, I used to work at an ice cream shop, and this sweet little old man came in and he was telling us that, since his wife died, he wasn't really eating well, We're trying to help this man out. Out of nowhere, unprompted, he goes, yeah, so when my wife and I were younger, there was this man who was hitting on my wife and making her feel uncomfortable. So I grabbed him by the shirt and I just slammed him against the gate and I hit him until he died. And I was like, sir, you've just confessed murder to me and I don't know how to respond to that because this is an ice cream shop. Do you want the ice cream, yes or no? So many times, right, we have our expectations of what these conversations are supposed to look like, and then suddenly people throw us a fun little curveball that you go like, I don't really know what is the reasonable response to that. Lastly, nonverbal cues, right? So things like eye contact, physical touch, masking, facial expressions, all of those, right? We change depending on the situation we're in. For example, if you're getting yelled at by your boss or your parents, you're probably not keeping a lot of eye contact unless you're particularly defiant. Versus, if somebody's telling you something super emotional, you're probably holding a lot more eye contact. Physical touch, right, where it's appropriate, what your relationship is. There's a difference between, holding your partner's hand versus a complete stranger's. That'd be pretty weird for everyone involved. Social knowledge then is all about how people understand where we actually gain knowledge from. So nativists believe that knowledge is given either by God, evolution, or genetics. So nativists believe essentially we're born with a certain level of knowledge, right? It's just inherently coded into our system. Empiricists believe sensory experiences are reflection on sensory experiences give us knowledge. So we actually have to do a thing to know what it is, or at least reflect on those things. Kantian synthesis then combines both, right? So sensory experiences help us acquire knowledge, but it's based on given knowledge. So for example, we can go back to our example from earlier in the semester, right? You have the AC that is currently off, but it was on earlier. And we can tell that it's cold, and we can't tell exactly how many degrees it is, but we can tell that it's colder in here than it is outside. So that would be kind of how Kantian synthesis works. Classical stimulus then believes stimulus is inherently ambiguous because we don't receive enough information to fully understand. So in other words, right, we can tell that it's colder in here than it is outside, but we can't say precisely what degree of temperature it is in here versus outside. And then ecological stimulus provides enough information to develop knowledge. So again, we can probably make a somewhat educated guess on the temperature, potentially based on, what we have available to us. So impression formation then, obviously, a lot of our social perception comes from first impressions that we have of people, and we kind of build from those, either proving that we were right or that we were incorrect. So social perception posits that everyone and everything exists independently of the viewer. Obviously, once you leave this classroom, I don't just stop existing until your next class. I very much exist outside of this classroom, just as you do, even if we're not constantly seeing each other. We, of course, use our senses to form internal mental representations. That's why, for example, if I say, when you think of what it feels like to bite an apple, you can, even if you're not physically biting an apple. And we're gonna look at that a little bit later on in the semester. We also use language, mainly adjectives, to linguistically perceive others with 6 major categories. So, and these kind of tend to build up on each other, right? So let's say you're trying to have somebody remember, you and your friend are talking, you're trying to remember the name of a specific person. And you start, chico, tú sabes, el alto. El muchacho ese que es bien alto, right? You start with physical. El que es bien alto, que es medio colorado. Chico, tú sabes, ese nene, ¿cómo es que se llama? Right? So you start with physical, then you might go with behavior, right? Que él es bien cool, que él tiene como este flow bien de skater, que es como bien chill. Ese tipo, ¿cómo es que él se llama? Then your social relations, ¿no te acuerdas que lo vimos en el cumpleaños del novio de Pamela? ¿Te acuerdas? Right? You build from that. If they're not from here, right? El grillito ese, chico, es así como medio irlandés. And then your functional properties, right? How do they make you feel? Acho, es que en verdad siempre la paso tan bien cuando él está, whatever. Right? So, or if you actually hate them, right? You're like, ay, tú sabes el tipo ese, es feo. Acho, no te imaginas. Right? So that's usually how we kind of use these 6 major categories, or at least some of them, to differentiate people. And usually those conversations end with, yo sé que tú me hablas, yo no me acuerdo el nombre, pero sí, ese tipo, sí. Wrong with social perception, right? We reduce the complexity of humans to single traits or images that create a cohesive impression of a person. In other words, we kind of narrow down who a person is based on who they are with us. So obviously that ignores parts of their identity with other people, right? We have friends that might just be our friends that we just go out with, who might be somebody's most intimate, closest friend who they tell our secrets to. And, we kind of have narrowed this person down in a more kind of shallow way. Time and experience can also alter initial impressions. Happens a lot when you meet somebody and you're like, I hate this person. And then fast forward, you're suddenly best friends. And it's like, I remember when I met you, I hated you. Found you so annoying. And now we're besties. The same thing happens in the opposite direction, right? You might have been like, this person was my best friend, and now we don't speak to each other at all. Or you dated somebody, and obviously you had a significantly nicer impression of them when you started dating than when you stopped dating, most likely. It's also influenced by needs, expectations, and interpersonal relationships. So, whatever you need at the time, is that person able to fulfill those needs? So, for example, if you're a very emotional person, if you have a person who's just like, I don't do feelings, it's probably not going to be somebody who has a very important role in your life. Expectations, whether they can meet those or not, and how well you communicate those is very important. And then interpersonal relationships, right? It happens, we kind of have the little pack mentality of, my friend doesn't like you, so I don't like you. We kind of don't give everybody an equal opportunity in that sense. We view people as a sum total of their characteristics. That has a lot to do with the first point that we covered. Or we view people as the result of the relationship between each of these characteristics with one another. So when these don't make sense, that's when we start to have kind of interpersonal conflicts, right? If it's, oh, well, this is the friend who always shows up and they're always supportive, and then one day they're just like, I can't handle it. You kind of take that personally because you're like, well, that's not my expectation of you as a person. And so that can create some issues. Implicit personality theory then believes that people are split into 5 reliable dimensions of personality. Now, obviously, take these with a grain of salt. There's a lot of gray areas in between, even though this is a very binary type of list. So, extroversion. So, is the person extroverted or introverted? Are they very, very sociable, or do they prefer to kind of be on their own or with like smaller groups? Are they honest versus secretive? Are they people who are super open about whatever is going on in their life? Or are they people who you are like, I've known this person for years and I still have no idea what they do for a living, or what their parents' names are, or where they live? Adventurous versus cautious, right? People who are very much like, I love to live on the edge and do all my crazy nonsense. And then the friend who is always like, is that safe? Should we be doing this? Should we maybe take a second to rethink our life decisions? And sociable versus reclusive, right? A lot of that has to do with extroversion versus introversion. Agreeableness, right? So nice versus mean. Trusting versus jealous doesn't necessarily have to be kind of like relationship jealous, but like, que tú fuiste al cine con este pana y no me invitaste, diantre, ok, está bien, no me invites, right? Gentle versus abrasive, my sister and I are perfect examples of that. You hurt my feelings and I'm just like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to deal with it. My sister's like, eso es un problema tuyo, de verdad, no te gusta como yo lo hice, pues, bendito. Ay, Dios, mira cómo lloro. And that's my sister, she's very abrasive. Cooperative versus negative, right? Team players versus people who are very kind of like individualistic and they're like, mira, trabajo en grupo no es para mí, yo voy a hacerlo solo. Y everything's gonna get done. Conscientiousness, right? So, clean versus careless, right? There's people who are very much like, I have to do the dishes and I get them done in a timely manner. And people who are like, have those dishes been in there for a month? Yeah, pero pues yo le eché agüita y un poquito de jabón, so they're not moldy, just roll with it. Dependable versus unreliable, right? For example, something bad happens, you know that there's friends who will pick up the phone when you call them, and there's friends who you can call them 78 times and they are not going to pick up that phone. Moral versus immoral, this is obviously very subjective based on what your morals are. And persevering versus quitting, right? There's people who are like, I had a roadblock, guess that means it's not made for me, moving on to something else. And people who are like, I'm just going to keep trying and trying and trying until it kind of works out. Emotional stability, so poised versus nervous, calm versus anxious, composed versus excitable, and non-hypochondriacal versus hypochondriacal. So a lot of these are basically the opposites of, are you cool, calm, and collected when pressure kind of sets in, or are you just kind of freaking out? And then in terms of culture, right, people who are artistically sensitive versus insensitive. In other words, people who are like, you can value art and you want to talk about a movie after you saw it, or, you went to a concert or a new album was released and you want to talk about its merit as art, versus people who are just like, yeah, okay, that was cool anyway, moving on to the next thing, or who don't like to go see movies or listen to music and all that. Intellectual versus unreflective, right? There's people who kind of are very self-aware, constantly thinking about things, the world, themselves, all of that, and people who are just kind of like, I'm here right now. I'm thinking about the exact thing that I'm doing right now, and then when I stop doing it, I don't think about it anymore. Refined versus crude, right? So, a lot of that has to do with manners, right? How proper you behave in society. And imaginative versus simple, right? There's people who are very straightforward, who kind of see the world very much in the existing processes and that's it, versus people who are very out of the box type of thinkers. So the social relation model can be split in a few different ways, and we're going to look at a few of them, but they're basically about how we perceive different relationships in general. So the constant is how people generally think of others. So let's say that our constant is that all people generally think that all other people are good by nature. The actor then is how you think people are in general, so that can be against the constant. Even if most people in this room generally agree that all people are good by nature, you might think that they're bad by nature. The partner, how others think you are in general. So if people think you are, in this case, a good or a bad person. Relationship, how you think a specific person is. So you think your mom is a good person. And occasion, how you think a specific person is in a specific context. So you might have, for example, somebody who's very usually kind of like your shy, quiet friend, but when they're working, maybe they're, the manager of their own business, or the business owner, and they're a lot more assertive in that specific scenario, even if that's not how they usually are on their day-to-day. Likewise here, right? The perceiver, how you view others in general. So target, how one person views others in general. The relationship is how one person views another particular person. Well, this obviously has to do with the relationship we have with that person. Obviously, you view your best friend much better than whoever, is your best friend's worst enemy. Assimilation, so stereotypes or biases for a large group of similar people, how you generally feel towards a specific group of people. I don't know, how you feel towards skateboarders or surfers based on your interaction with skateboarders or surfers. Consensus, the general agreement of how all people view a specific person. So if you're in a friend group, right, you might all collectively be like, yeah, that's like our friend who doesn't talk a lot, but they're really nice. The uniqueness, how one person views another as different from others, and how others' views might differ from this person. So in other words, the way that I view my sister and within our relationship might be very different than the way all of you would probably view my sister if you met her, versus how her bosses view her clients view her, etc. Same here, right? So all of these are kind of more or less the same, right? How two people view each other in the same way in terms of reciprocity. So, for example, if I view Lisandro as a nice guy, does Lisandro also view me as a nice person? Generalized, if one's generalized view is reflected onto oneself, if you generally think people are nice, do you see yourself as a nice person, or do you see yourself as outside of that kind of scope? Dyadic, if one person views another in a specific way, are they viewed the same way? In other words, if one of you views the person next to you as funny, does that person also view you that way? Assumed reciprocity is the assumption that if one person views another in a specific way, they're viewed the same way. So if I say, this is my best friend, you can assume that that person also sees me as their closest friend. Self-other agreement, how much you view yourself the way a specific person views you. So, your friend's like, oh my God, super funny. Do you also see yourself that way, or do you go like, I'm not funny at all, but thank you. And then assume similarity, you view others how you view yourself. So if you think, I'm a nice, chill person, you probably view everybody else in your life through the same lens and kind of make judgments based on that. Beyond facial perception, right? Other things that can influence our social perceptions include things like social distance. Obviously, not super weird if your closest friend comes up to you in a public place and gives you a hug. However, it's super uncomfortable when you're standing in line and somebody that you don't know is like right on top of you. You can feel them breathe on your neck and you're like, I do not know you, please step away from me. Right? If you go and you hold your, as I said earlier, right? You hold your partner's hand, super normal. Holding a stranger's hand, kind of weird. Your posture, right? So if you're kind of doing this, you kind of tell that somebody's bored. They're not really listening to what you're saying. If somebody's kind of, standing like this, you might be like, well, they're very defensive, right? So those play a role. Intentional covering or uncovering of body parts. So, for example, certain cultures are very big on covering for modesty, right? Or if you go to certain religious spaces, you're meant to cover up. In terms of uncovering, I usually think of that more in terms of if you think somebody's cute, you're going to be wearing something that's going to show off your nicest assets to see that person, because you want them to look at you and be like, that person is also cute. Maybe we can be cute together. And then gestures, right? The way that we move our bodies, the way that our faces move, all of that can obviously influence our perception of the situation. And then in terms of taste and expression, right? The music that we listen to, the clothes that we wear, how we wear our hair, how we dress, how we decorate our spaces, all of these things can tell us some information about a person, right? Obviously, if you see somebody dressed very, kind of grunge, you can be like, well, they probably listen to rock music. And if you walk into my apartment and you see a ton of books, you can assume that I like to read. So we can somewhat make assumptions about people based on taste. And then their behavior, obviously, for example, sometimes, I don't know, if those of you who have siblings, when you're around your friends who don't have siblings, and they just say and do things that are so only child things, and you're like, wow, you've never had to live in a house with more than one person, and it shows, right? So you can tell those things through people's behavior. You can tell, for example, how they were raised, right? Might have some friends who are very much still in this kind of tradition of, they say good morning to every single person that they see, and they're very polite and all of this, and that might not be how you grow up. Or your friends who aren't religious, but when their grandma calls, they still go bendición, abuela, and you're you don't even believe in God, but that's the thing, and that's how they grew up, right? So all of those play a role. So that brings us to other things that can influence our perspective that we haven't necessarily completely touched on. I mean, we slightly touched on history when we did the oral discussion. However, there's still other things in history, more traditional history, that can definitely affect the way that we perceive the world, that we perceive reality, affects our interactions. Generational trauma is one of those things, right? So things like slavery and the Holocaust. There have been scientific studies done to evidence that people who have had family members who were survivors of the Holocaust or who were slaves kind of carry that trauma generationally. It's kind of encoded into their DNA somehow. So it is something that affects them. Obviously, it also makes them a bit more keenly aware to these things, right? When you're growing up hearing these stories, it's very different for you to grow up in a household where perhaps you had a grandparent who was a Holocaust survivor and, would tell you stories that are, a lot more personal, than, if you're just learning it kind of in the abstract sense of the context of a history class. That can definitely have a huge influence in how you perceive the world. You're probably more sensitive to situations. So for example, you're seeing patterns that are similar to those big kind of historical events. It's easier for you to see them, and it probably makes you, more likely to fight against these things. Beyond that, right, we have cycles. So certain similarities between occurrences of historical events. We can sometimes see different things, the same things happening through different periods of time, right? Or we can see similarities between political leaders or current historical events that can match up to things that we've seen before and either see the positive influence of it, right? We can be like, oh, this person, likes to lead like a particularly good leader. But we can also then see different things and be like, oh, this is very reminiscent of a darker time in history. We should not repeat those things.
You know what they said, that history repeats itself every 80 years.
Yeah, and we can see that, right? Even if it's not exactly the same, right? I'm sure kind of combining generational trauma and cycles, right? People who probably have, ties back to the Holocaust, potentially kind of seeing what's happening in Palestine right now, might be having probably kind of mixed feelings about that situation. And it can help us also kind of feel more connected to other people when you can see similarities in history, right? So I took a post-colonial literature class when I was in my undergrad, and it was about like Indian post-colonial history, but it was pretty similar to our history here in Puerto Rico. The same thing happened when I went to Ireland. A lot of the history, a lot of Irish history is very similar to our history. And that kind of helped kind of bridge those divides where it was like, I mean, do I have any particular connection to Ireland? No, but, I could interact with these people and find links there. Cultural history, so teaching or erasing of it. There was a time, I think we've mostly moved past this, but there was a time, particularly in the US, where there were a lot of people who were denying that the Holocaust ever happened. And so they were asking teachers to not teach about it in their classrooms, or they were kind of revising the way the history of things like slavery were told, or avoiding it altogether. And that obviously kind of creates problems, right? Because we are then ignoring big significant historical events. That makes us likelier to repeat those events because we're unfamiliar with them. We're not really thinking about the long-term consequences and results of those events. And it creates then obviously a lot of tensions, particularly for those communities then who are having their histories kind of altered or not told whatsoever, right? And that happens here a lot. We don't really get taught a lot of Puerto Rican history, and the way that we're taught it is not usually in a way that necessarily bolsters our national pride. It's just kind of like, you guys were colonized twice. That sucks. That's pretty sad. So obviously, they don't teach us about, the great political figures that we did have during, Ayuda Helares, the time of La Masacre de Ponce, all these things we might hear bits and pieces here and there, but we're not really taught our history in a way that is positive or that really kind of reinforces our kind of social character and cultural character. Good versus evil as well, right? History is usually written by the people who won. So who's good and who's evil is also a matter of perspective, right? Obviously, if you think, for example, about how we're originally taught about where Thanksgiving comes from, right? It's just kind of like, oh no, the Pilgrims showed up and like the Native Americans were just like, here, have our giant continent-sized country. We don't need it. We'll just take tiny little reservations. It's obviously not what happened. It's a lot more complex than that. There's a lot of trauma that went into that with the Trail of Tears and Native Americans kind of being treated as foreigners in their own country. But obviously the way that story is told is not really in a way that reflects the character of the Native Americans. They would tell those stories very differently. It's the same, right? When I was learning about how Puerto Rico came to be a colony of the US, in the US, it was a very different story than what I would get here. So obviously it depends who's writing these history books, who's writing these accounts, and from what perspective we're getting that information. That's obviously going to color the way that we see it. Obviously, way back when, there were probably slightly more positive tellings of why the Holocaust was okay, even though we all obviously know that it wasn't. Because depending on, again, who's writing that, I'm sure if a Nazi wrote a history book, they'd be like, no, that was a good thing that we did, despite the fact that we're all obviously very horrified about that. Hindsight, so perceptions on what's acceptable or right can change through time. There were times, well, there was a time when slavery was illegal. Obviously now we think about it and we're like, yeah, that's a really messed up thing. You shouldn't own another person. And the whole notion of, Black people being, I think it was like a quarter or a third of a person or something like that. Where I would be like, that was really messed up. That was not cool. But at that time, it was seen as acceptable. And we see what one of the things that happens, and this kind of has to go with that cultural erasure, is that when, as time passes, right, we're judging everything from our present perspective as opposed to, the perspective of the past. And then we have people try to do things like ban certain books because they use language that's outdated, or it's there's things that happen that might seem inappropriate to us now, but culturally at that time they were okay. So it is kind of difficult then for us to choose to judge the past based on the lens of the present, because there's just kind of context there and perceptions that we're not really aware of. And lastly, the notions of shame and repentance, right? So there are historical events that people have an active distaste for. So for example, nowadays, most people in Germany don't really, talk about the Holocaust as a prideful moment in their history. They have a lot of shame surrounding that, and a lot of recognition of it, a lot of acknowledgement of we did do these things, and it is important that we talk about it, but we don't talk about it in a sense of pride. Whereas, for example, nowadays you might still have people who are very fond of, their Confederate pride or their Southern pride, which some justifications there are kind of cultural and I can somewhat understand, but some of them are kind of based on these racist notions that were a part of the line of thinking when the American Civil War happened. But that sense of pride then can come off as very disrespectful to people who did suffer, obviously, whose ancestors suffered from slavery, and it can kind of send the wrong message of there not really being an acknowledgement of the damage that the Confederacy did have on certain communities, despite there perhaps being elements that it's okay to feel, happy and proud of in terms of like your Southern heritage. So perhaps one of the biggest shifts of perspective that we had is about the Salem witch trials, right? So you're probably all very familiar with this. Salem, Massachusetts, a bunch of mostly women were hung because they were accused of being witches. So we're going to take a minute then to watch this video, and then we'll talk a little bit about that and its kind of relationship to changes in perception.
And we're back in third quarter planning. Adams, we're back in this project, and she's looking pretty tired.
You've been accused of a crime you did not commit. It's impossible to prove your innocence. If you insist that you're innocent anyway, you'll likely be found guilty and executed. But if you confess, apologize, and implicate others for good measure, you'll go free. Do you give a false confession or risk a public hanging? This was the choice facing those accused of witchcraft in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, between February 1692 and May 1693. They were the victims of paranoia about the supernatural, misdirected religious fervor, and a justice system that valued repentance over truth. Salem was settled in 1626 by Puritans, a group of English Protestants. Life was strict and isolated for the people of Salem. Battles with their Native American neighbors and groups of French settlers were commonplace. People feared starvation and disease, and relations between villagers were strained. To make matters worse, 1692 brought one of the coldest winters on record. That winter, two cousins, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, started behaving very strangely. A physician found nothing physically wrong, but diagnosed the girls as under an evil hand. Puritans believed that the devil wreaked havoc in the world through human agents, or witches, who blighted nature, conjured fiendish apparitions, and tormented children. As news swept through the village, the symptoms appeared to spread. Accounts describe 12 so-called afflicted girls contorting their bodies, having fits, and complaining of prickling skin. 4 of the girls soon accused 3 local women of tormenting them. All 3 of the accused were considered outsiders in some way. On February 29th, the authorities arrested Sarah Good, a poor pregnant mother of a young daughter, Sarah Osborne, who had long been absent from church and was suing the family of one of her accusers, and Tituba, an enslaved woman in Benny Paris's home known by her first name only. Tituba denied harming the girls at first, but then she confessed to practicing witchcraft on the devil's orders and charged Good and Osborne with having forced her. Osborne and Good both maintained their innocence. Osborne died in prison, while Good's husband turned against her in court, testifying that she was a witch or would be one very quickly. Good's 4-year-old daughter was imprisoned and eventually gave testimony against her mother. Meanwhile, Good gave birth in jail. Her baby died, and she was convicted and hanged shortly thereafter. Tituba was held in custody until May and then released. These 3 victims were just the beginning. As accusations multiplied, others, like Tituba, made false confession to save themselves. The authorities even reportedly told one accused witch that she would be hanged if she did not confess and freed if she did. They were not particularly interested in thoroughly investigating the charges. In keeping with their church's teachings, they preferred that the accused confessed, asked for forgiveness, and promised not to engage in more witchcraft. The court accepted all kinds of dubious evidence, including so-called spectral evidence, in which the girls began raving when supposedly touched by invisible ghosts. Complicating matters further, many of the jurors in the trials were relatives of the accusers, compromising their objectivity. Those who dared to speak out, such as Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, came under suspicion. By the spring of 1693, over 100 people had been imprisoned, and 14 women and 6 men had been executed. By this time, accusations were starting to spread beyond Salem to neighboring communities, and even the most powerful figures were targets. When his own wife was accused, the governor of Massachusetts colony suspended the trials. Sentences were amended, prisoners released, and arrests stopped. Some have speculated that the girls were suffering from hallucinations caused by fungus, or a condition that caused swelling of the brain. But ultimately, the reason for their behavior is unknown. What we do know is that adults accepted violent accusations by children as hard evidence. Today, the Salem witch trials were made a cautionary tale of the dangers of groupthink and scapegoating and the power of fear to manipulate human perception. Weaponized accusation.
So are there any initial thoughts that y'all would like to share about the video? Anything that stood out to you? Anything that relates to kind of notions of perception that we talked about?
For me, it's kind of curious how the people just took first-hand the accusations that the kids made about other people, even though there were kids, some don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
They just took it at face value.
Yeah, and it's kind of complicated with kids, 'cause obviously, I mean, they tend to be painfully honest. Kids will tell you a lot of things. And if you've ever interacted with an elementary school teacher, they sure hear some interesting stories about their parents that they didn't need to know. But at the same time, my kids also have overactive imaginations, or they're not necessarily familiar with everything to the extent that we are as we get older. And that can obviously kind of shift those perceptions. Anything else anyone wanted to?
También influencia mucho y que en ese tiempo cuando yo tenía un pensamiento diferente ya había buscado tu primería, tenía alguna opinión diferente, pero tenía alguna creencia diferente a los demás. Y también era el mayor juicio decir, diferente del no hay que eso no es de
Yeah, it was a more kind of homogeneous time, pretty conservative time as well.
no es necesario como que sea como que tenía que hacer, ¿sabes? Que ya va a ser duro.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've ever come across, I know I've seen it make its rounds online, kind of like all the things that women used to be kind of either accused of being witches for, or like kind of sent to mental institutions over, and it would be things like reading a book. Very normal, kind of things that are very normal activities for now, right? But it was like if you were, it was a time where you were kind of supposed to be a little bit more subservient as a woman in anything, anytime that you brought up
Y eso
that.
no se ve hoy en día. Básicamente por allá. Por eso claro,
Anyone else would like to share their thoughts on the video? Anything else that stood out to you?
yeah, probably like the boys and students. Perceptions. Like, there's the fact that you don't need really know someone, you don't affect that.
Yeah, and I think we can still kind of see that, right, I mean, in less extreme ways, right, but we are talking about, you know, there's certain people that if they look a certain way, you're still kind of like, that person might mean me harm, and they might be the nicest, loveliest person you ever met, right, but we're kind of conditioned to, view certain people and certain, actions and behaviors, in certain ways, and fear can obviously make us do a lot of silly things, right, that's why when we watch horror movies, we run through our hallways, if it's too dark, because we think there's a monster in the dark, even though consciously you're aware that there isn't. And I think it's fascinating, right? Because these were these people's neighbors, right? I mean, think about your neighbor. I mean, even if you think about just your classmates here, you're probably not close to everybody, but you have some level of interaction, even if it's just kind of like set you up in groups to work, right? But this notion of, you know, you kind of knew these people somewhat, and they're so easily kind of turning against them, making these accusations, kind of shunning them, being totally cool with being like, yeah, no, if they were accused, then it must be true. Definitely has, you know, that quick shift of perspective, that pressure also to kind of keep accusing people and lie, essentially, which is controversial. I think that kind of falls into political perspectives, right? Then beyond that, right, you mentioned the conflict of interest with everyone or most of the people kind of being part of the jury, being related to the people who accused others. Obviously now, and I assume this has a big part to do with that, it is illegal for you to kind of be part of a jury if you know the person, because either you're gonna favor them, you know, if your mom's on trial, you're probably gonna be like, my mom is innocent of whatever you're accusing her of. If it's somebody you hate, you're probably like, I don't care if they did it or not, they should go to jail, because I don't like them. It's not very helpful. And then of course, you know, there's this shift at the end, of video where the governor suddenly, when his wife was accused, then he's like, maybe we should stop. Maybe this isn't what we should be doing, and maybe we shouldn't go with these accusations. And that happens a lot, right? When things aren't relevant to us, we might have a passive interest in it, you know, we might be like, yeah, it sucks and it shouldn't happen, but whatever. Versus when it's actively then either affecting us or somebody we care about, we're obviously a lot more involved in those matters, so. So in the case of the Salem witch trials, right, women were perceived as evil witches and outsiders. So their cause was lost before they could even make it to trial, as Tani very rightfully pointed out, right, at that time, anything that kind of put you away from the very straight and narrow path was a reason to make you an outsider and treat you like an outcast and kind of make a spectacle out of that. Now, obviously, our historical perspective of that time has changed a lot. Obviously, now we view it as a huge tragedy. A lot of innocent people who hadn't really done anything suffered and lost their lives. But it is proof of how biased perception and perspective can lead to dangerous and fatal decisions. If you're considered an outsider, clearly you are responsible for whatever wrong you're accused of. And I think in less excessively dramatic scales, right, we might have seen this play out even in just friend groups, right? If there's a particular person who kind of always goes against the grain, or kind of stands up for themselves or goes against what the major group thinks, it's possible, right, that kind of people turn against them. Suddenly it's, oh, they're lame for not wanting to do this thing. Or, you kind of start seeing those differences and people kind of being ostracized within their group, which a lot of times then leads for people to feeling like they have to conform. Meaning perception and perspective already condemning someone for just who they are, which is obviously not fair, it's not objective either, particularly in a court of law. So effects on contemporary society, perhaps the biggest way that perception and perspective shape us nowadays is through the use of media. We spend a lot of time consuming media, whether it's, social media, right, Facebook, Twitter, television. Television and film also play a role, right, in forming our thoughts and shifting our perceptions, right? So as much as I kind of say this is a joke, one of the first movies I ever saw in movie theaters was the original Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire. And I'm not gonna lie to y'all, part of my way of life of being like I should help people out all the time comes from the fact that I watched Spider-Man and it just touched something inside of my heart that, affected me. And there's a bunch of other factors that influence that, including the way that I was brought up and, my religion and all these things. But that was still something that influenced me, right? We talked about a different one earlier on. I talked about Les Mis, right? That was when I saw that movie 87,000 times, right? It kind of taught me this lesson about the importance of trying to view things from other people's perspectives because, it's not really usually a case of villain versus hero. People just kind of have their different perspectives and whoever is telling the story is always going to come across as the person who's right. So obviously, the media that we consume, the shows that we watch, the movies that we watch, whatever your favorite movie or show is that because it resonated something within you, right? Something about those characters made you feel seen or understood, or it made you, change your way of thinking about something. In terms of social media, obviously, it can have very positive effects, very negative effects, and we'll talk about those in a bit. But obviously, what we see on social media, we kind of treat as reality, even if on like a subconscious level, we're aware that it's not the most real depiction or the most accurate depiction of most people's lives. It still plays a crucial role on how we're perceiving how society operates today. Things that we may not like at first may end up becoming part of our repertoire. But how does this happen? It's simple. Sometimes we change our minds about something, right? So sometimes it's just part of growing up or exposing yourself to different things, right? When I was younger, I was very much a t-shirts and jeans, and I'm still pretty much a t-shirt and jean kind of person, but I was like, none of that girly stuff. I don't do makeup. I don't do dresses. I don't do skirts. I don't do pastels. It was all dark and gloomy. And then, well, you're seeing me standing here in a skirt and makeup, so I think you can obviously tell that perception obviously changed. And it wasn't really that anybody coerced me into it. It was just kind of like, listen, I grew up and I realized that wearing skirts and dresses is just really comfortable. And you can look really dressed up with minimal effort as opposed to having to put on a pair of pants every morning. So hooray for that. But other times, we may think that it's best to conform or go with the flow. After all, we've seen what happens to outsiders, right? So there are times in our lives when we'll be hanging out with our friends or even with our families, right? Depending on what relationship you have with your parents. They might have an opinion that you disagree with, but you might just kind of go along with it either to avoid a fight or just to not feel like the opposites, right? Here. And, many people would rather sacrifice something in order to fit in with contemporary society instead of being ostracized. But I do say, kind of weigh those things in a scale. There's things that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. If you sacrifice them, you hate seeing Marvel movies, but your friends want to go watch a Marvel movie and you kind of go with the flow because whatever. I mean, at most you've lost like 3 hours of your life, but it's not the worst thing in the world. You've not done a huge sacrifice that's going to affect you. However, if the things that you're compromising on then kind of go against your morals and ethics and who you understand yourself to be as a person, that's a little bit more complicated, right? You shouldn't be putting yourself in situations where you feel unable to speak up or you feel like you're doing things that go against who you are as a person, just to keep people happy. Maybe in those situations, it's kind of important to reevaluate who you are spending your time with if they're still pressuring you in that way. Self-perception and social media then, of course, we all have access to social media, grew up with it. And that obviously plays a huge role in how we perceive ourselves. One of those things is because we end up endlessly comparing ourselves to everybody else. This person has nicer clothes or a bigger house or a better car. They're always on vacation, they have more money, and you kind of just sit there and you go like, how do these people who are my age afford to go on a trip like every month? And I'm here barely able to afford like ramen for the week. It does have an effect on how we perceive ourselves, because then we feel like we're perpetually behind, or like we should be doing more. We should be having 78 side hustles and a job and all these things. And that's going to take a toll, right? Long term, it's going to affect the way that we feel about ourselves, because we're constantly not, matching up to these expectations. Obviously, there's the physical aspects of it, right? We can keep going, like this person is prettier than me, or stronger than me, or skinnier than me, etc. And it creates a lot of like insecurities in people. With that comes, of course, unrealistic expectations in Photoshop. There are accounts entirely dedicated to kind of being like, this is the picture the celebrity posted, this is what it actually looked like before they Photoshopped it. Or for example, if you follow like beauty influencers, a lot of times they kind of use filters and stuff, edit the pictures, obviously to make the makeup look brighter and all of that. And then, you're putting on makeup and you're like, why does my face not look perfectly flawless? And like, there's never been a pore there, or any type of imperfection, but that's not how skin normally works, right? But, we do get affected by these things that we see, and kind of frustrated when, we're not really matching up to that. Mental health effects, right? There's a lot of depression and anxiety that is kind of rooted in too much exposure to social media, right? If you're constantly comparing yourself, you're going to be very depressed. You're going to feel again like you're always behind, like you can't really match up to these expectations. In terms of anxiety, right? It might just be the anxiety, what do I post? And, doesn't matter if I do this, and, I can't say this or I can't do that. And it's all very stressful, way more stressful than it should be, and way more stressful than the internet kind of was at its inception. In terms of physical health, right, it can lead to disordered eating, right? Again, you're trying to match up to these perfect bodies that you're seeing all of the time, and then that starts to affect how you actually take care of yourself, because you want kind of quick and immediate results. And you don't really consider a lot of aspects that go into, your physical fitness and all of that. Your financial health, right, spending beyond your means, there's trends, and then you want to follow them and you want to stay on top of everything. So you're, buying expensive clothes that you can't really afford, or you're putting everything on a credit card, to go on this trip because everyone is going on a trip. So why aren't you? There's all of this constant pressure to kind of keep up with everything. And, you have to get a Tesla because this is the thing, and everybody has all these things, and you need more stuff, and you're buying them, or you're not trendy anymore, and you're not in, and you're falling behind, and you get very stressful. It happens a lot also with kids, right? Kids are a lot more susceptible. They'll be watching, their favorite YouTuber, and their favorite YouTuber is like, hey, I have merch, or like, here's this game or this product that you should have. And they're kind of spending their parents' money without their parents knowing, to kind of keep up with all these things, show support. And that can obviously affect your financial health. Notions of perceived affluence and privilege, right? I talked about this before. You can kind of fake everything now. You can rent designer clothes, and you can rent expensive cars and get a swanky Airbnb and pretend that is your life. So there's also like places that are just sets for photos, including one I saw once that looks like you're inside of a plane. So take everything you see online with a grain of salt, because a lot of it is kind of faked. Parasocial relationships, right? I think, when I was growing up, social media still wasn't like the biggest thing. So the way you found out information about your favorite celebrities was through like magazines. So I used to buy all these like teenager magazines that they used to sell. I don't know if they sell them anymore. Right, but there was still that barrier, right? It was still like, this is not a person that I know, because the only way I know about them is either I see their movies or their TV shows, or I listen to their music, and then I read their interviews in these magazines. But now, one of the issues with why parasocial relationships happen is that our actual lives and then these influencers and these celebrities are mixed together in our social media feeds, right? So you're scrolling and you're like, here's a picture of my friend's cat, here's a picture of my mom, here's Rihanna, here's, a picture of my best friend at the beach, here's my friend's vacation photo, here's another celebrity, right? And so because it's kind of intermingled, we feel more of a closeness than there actually is. Another thing that happens, and I think this is with the rise of like influencers, YouTubers, TikTokers, they tend to, share a lot more about their personal lives, so you feel like you know them, right? The people that you follow, there's a big chance that you follow them because something about them you've connected with, right? Oh, this person likes the same games that I like to play, or they've talked about things that are important to me. And so you feel a connection there that again doesn't exist when you're just seeing somebody in a movie, or a TV show or listening to their music. And it creates these kind of parasocial relationships where we feel like we know these people, like they're our friends, and like we're entitled to kind of know everything about their lives, which is very unhealthy. And then the notions of the ideal cyber self versus your self-image, right? There's these, again, you can curate your feeds to look, to fit a particular aesthetic or, present a specific version of yourself. And if you're constantly used to, you'll see there and you'll look at all your pictures and you'll be like, I look so nice in all of these. And then on my average day, I kind of just look like a potato, and you feel bad about yourself because you're not constantly living up to that person who exists just on the internet, who's always traveling or who's always perfectly made up or who's always looking great, always at the gym or whatever. And that obviously plays a huge toll on how we perceive ourselves. Obviously, there's good things about social media, in sense of creating a sense of belonging. So, online friends through mutual interest groups, forums, etc. It's really helpful if you're not like the most social person, or you have a hard time kind of taking that first step to talk to a person you think is cool. The internet is your friend, and that way I've made a lot of friends. That way, people who were friends of friends, and I thought they were super cool, but I was like, I don't know how to start a conversation. So, you passively look at their stories until you kind of get a sense of what they like, and then suddenly you send them a meme, and then suddenly they send a meme back, and now you're besties, and it's all great. It kind of helps, kind of break the ice in that way. If you have like interests that are kind of niche, right? You're like, nobody in my life watches this super obscure show or likes this band. There's a group on the internet somewhere for you, right? Where you can still nerd out with people about that. There's forums, you can go to for advice or again, similar interests. And it can kind of help you create a community, even if it's not necessarily a physical one. It is a way to stay in touch with loved ones, right? Obviously, people move away or, you go on with your life. Maybe you still, you want to know what your extended family is doing. You want to kind of know how your best friend from elementary school is doing in life. You don't really have the energy or the time to keep up with everybody. Social media allows us to then kind of passively stay in touch, right? You can be like, here's a picture. My little cousin is not so little anymore because they just graduated high school, or, here's my best friend from middle school. He's, making stickers now and all this types of stuff where you can still be connected without having to, make that much effort. It's a good source for advice, right? You can ask the internet all sorts of questions and people will respond to you. You'll go to Reddit and you'll be like, hey, what's the best product for like curly hair or something like that? And people will have answers for you, or somebody will have asked the question already. It's a source for positive interactions. A lot of times we focus on the negative because there can be a lot of negative interactions online, but even amongst your friends, right? You post a picture and all your friends are like, oh my God, yes, you look so cute. This is amazing. I love it. I love it when it's like guys, because it just gets weird. They just start going like, oh my God, baby, I love you. Let's go out tonight. I'm gonna take you. And it's like, y'all need to chill. This is public. We're all seeing you hit on each other. Calm down, right? But it's cute, right? You can see your friends are being supportive. You're feeling yourself, and your friends are like, yes, oh my God, you're serving. We love it. We stand. Everything's great. So obviously that can make you feel good. It's a great place for self-expression as well, right? If you kind of still figuring out your identity, or you're kind of a little too self-conscious about being outside of the norms of, societies. The internet's a great place to kind of take that first step and be like, this is who I actually am, and we'll see how people like it, and go from there. I, despite the way that I dress for this job, have a more alternative style in my day-to-day, and social media kind of helped me figure out what I liked and kind of test the waters, because I'd be like, this outfit is super cool. I'm not cool enough to wear it. Then I post a picture and I was like, no, I love it. It's so great. And now I don't really think about that stuff anymore. So, right, that kind of helped through social media. And then access to information to strengthen your identity, right? If you're interested in a particular subculture, or if you have a particular mental health condition, for example, or a part of any type of community like the LGBTQ plus community, right? There's a lot of good, helpful information out there that can help you kind of then learn a little bit more about yourself, and kind of solidify who you are as a person, and you feel kind of less alone. So all of that's the good stuff. The not so good stuff. Rejection, right? People can choose to not follow you, people can choose to block you, people can choose to ignore your comments, etc., whatever you send them, and that can kind of affect us, right? Because obviously, if you're having an actual conversation with a person and they just walk away, I mean, it's rude, but it's a lot less likely to happen than somebody ignoring a comment or a message online. There's a lot of bullying, obviously, that goes on. The internet, we love to make fun of people, and you'll see the person just doing whatever it is that they enjoy to do. And you might find it a bit cringe, but instead of moving forward, moving on with your life, you kind of leave a comment telling them that it's super cringe, and everyone's kind of dogpiling on this person who just kind of wanted to do something that is, maybe a little bit embarrassing, but completely harmless. And that can obviously have a lot of really negative consequences, with, depression, suicide, and all of that. We have an obsession with status, right? And some people get too caught up in the fanfare of it, and suddenly like, oh, well, I need more people to follow me, and I need to constantly be posting, and I need to be relevant, and the algorithm, and all this other stuff that I don't really understand. Right? And in the grand scheme of things, these things don't matter, but they feel like they're more important than they actually are, right? You're like, oh, well, a friend has 5,000 followers, so like, why do I only have 1,000? And I need to do this, and this is like what's trendy, and this is what I need to post. And it becomes kind of like an unhealthy relationship there. Trends, they don't have to be bad, right? So, there can be like fashion trends and makeup trends and stuff like that. If you like it, go for it. But there are trends that obviously are dangerous or super toxic. Don't eat Tide Pods, and there's some trends out there that exist. I know there was one not that long ago on TikTok where it was kind of like it was something about like there's no such thing as two pretty best friends, and then like it would just exist to kind of make fun of the friend who clearly was not as pretty as the other one, and they like the comments were obviously super mean, and it was not a very helpful thing. It's kind of a malicious trend. You can have toxic echo chambers, right? Twitter and Reddit, big fans of toxic echo chambers, right? You just kind of go and say what you believe, and then everybody's kind of agreeing, and then if you say anything outside of that, it's not a good time. Passive consumption, right? Lurking versus posting. A lot of us have gotten into the very bad habit of just constantly scrolling for absolutely no reason. You just kind of sit there and you scroll. The TV's on, your mom's talking to you, but you're still scrolling, not really even fully accepting what you're looking at. Right? And I think when I was in college, Vine was the thing. And you wasted a lot of time on Vine because mentally you'd be like, it's just 10-second videos. But like you'd start at 10 and suddenly it's 3 a.m. and you're like, what did I just do with all of my time? Same thing happens with TikTok. You go on TikTok, you're like, I'll just watch a couple of videos, and then suddenly it's 2 hours later and you haven't had dinner because you got distracted. A need for validation, right? You post something you want, and you're trying to be funny and your friends don't react to it. You might be like, what the hell, I'm hilarious. Or if you post a picture where you're feeling yourself and you're like, I didn't get as many likes as this other post and all that. And again, the grand scheme of things doesn't matter, but it does kind of hurt our feelings, right? We want people to also agree with the things that we're saying. At some point, I think you can just say, listen, even if nobody else likes it, I do. I constantly torture everybody that I know with terrible puns. And even if nobody likes them, I think they're hilarious and they can deal with that. And then a sense of being ignored, right? Nowadays, everybody has their phone on them all of the time. And this kind of makes us act like insane people sometimes. You'll be like, I sent my friend a message. Why haven't they answered? When you start doing, things like looking at the last time they were online, you're like, why does it say they were last active 5 minutes ago, but I sent this message 2 hours ago? Why didn't they answer my message? And you get like insane. Or if you ever had it happen, I hate it when this happens. You go to click on something, but then you get a notification at the same time, and then you open the message, and now you feel like you have to respond, or else you're going to forget, and you don't want to seem like a jerk for not responding, and it kind of spirals off out of control. So those are some challenges there. Social media then and decision making does have an influence. There's a higher influence in terms of travel than finance, retail, or healthcare matters. So more people rely on kind of the opinions of the internet, for example, to decide where to go. I'm sure you've all seen the same 5 cliche pictures of Santorini in Greece, and you've all been like, well, I want to go there because it looks super aesthetic and super nice. So obviously that plays a role in that. I'm glad more people are going to the internet for healthcare and financial matters.
Well, right, word of mouth and friends and family are gonna influence you, right? If you're thinking of buying a product and then you see your friend that, who bought it and they're like, oh my God, this thing is like a lifesaver. You're much more likely to buy it because your friend already gave it a positive review than if it's just complete, anonymous people. Who you trust, right? Influencers, scams, and uninformed consumers. A lot of times people can get distracted by, and give a lot more credibility and trust into people who are some important online figures. And that's why you end up buying, detox teas from Kim Kardashian. That may or may not actually work. And that obviously can have an adverse effect, where we're not really looking into the things that we're buying. We're just kind of buying because somebody told us to. Companies then tend to rely on paid reviews and ads, right? Obviously, if somebody's getting paid to do an ad, they're not going to say anything bad. They might not be completely honest about it. People, delete reviews or pay for positive reviews that you don't even know are paid for. So that does have an adverse effect, but we can also have comments and forums that give us more concrete evidence, right? If you've ever seen one of those like kind of scam companies where it seems too good to be true, and it obviously is, you can get these Doc Martin boots today for $15, and it's like, no, you will not be getting them for $15. I guarantee you that, right? And then you go to the comments and somebody's like, don't order from these people. I placed my order 6 months ago and it still hasn't arrived. And you can be like, okay, it was a scam. Or you can go online, right, and be like, is this, a scam company? And somebody on the internet has asked that question before. You can learn from it, right? The internet does have a lot of qualified professionals who do use your platforms to kind of help you educate. And lastly, right, expectation versus reality, kind of being more aware. I think there's been, as I mentioned previously, right, a shift towards a slightly more realistic use of social media, so that people aren't constantly feeling anxious and depressed because of it. Which brings us to third person perception. So people tend to believe others are more susceptible to media's influence than they are themselves. In other words, we think that strangers are more likely to fall for, Instagram scams than we are. If the media influence is positive, though, example, being more susceptible to avoid drunk driving because of an ad, third person perception disappears, or the person being asked labels themselves as more susceptible, right? So you want to seem like you're a good person. So you're like, yeah, no, I totally saw that ad and it like freaked me out. And I would never do that. Third person perception is influenced by a desire to see ourselves as good, right? So you want to be like, no, I would never do such a thing or fall for that. And people are likely to think strangers or acquaintances are more easily influenced by media than close friends and partners. Obviously, we like to think that our friends are smarter than they may or may not be. So, we're more likely to be like, oh my God, no, I don't know a single person who would fall for this very obvious scam, even though you might. However, if the group or person being asked about is an expert or at least quite knowledgeable about a topic or perceived to be so, people are less likely to find them susceptible to media's influence, even if they're strangers. So for example, if it's kind of a scam product like whiten your teeth, and somebody's saying, do you think, dentists are susceptible to it? They'll realistically be like, no, dentists know a lot more about that stuff. So it's highly unlikely that a dentist is going to fall for this type of scam. People's perception of media impacts are the results of their best guess, using what they know about the world in order to reach as accurate an answer as possible to a question to which even media scholars do not have the real answer. In other words, right, we make these assumptions about people based on our general understanding of how society operates and how most people think. And lastly, the more exposed a person is to media, the likelier it is that they're more susceptible to it. Therefore, if a person is perceived as having a higher media consumption level than another, they'll be perceived as likelier to be influenced. In other words, if you have a friend who posts like every day, you probably think they're more susceptible because they're kind of, chronically online. That said, there are people who just kind of schedule their posts for a month and don't really look at, their accounts that much. So there is that to kind of consider. But it, you do feel like obviously they're going to be likelier to be more susceptible. So in terms of morality, right? Morality obviously influences our perceptions. And that can be influenced by a ton of things. Religion obviously being one, right? Your religion is going to influence what you find as good or evil. The law, for obvious reasons, laws exist for a reason, and obviously we decide what's right or wrong based on what those are, even though sometimes the law has been completely unfair. Nature versus nurture, right? The way that you grew up, there are things that you were taught that were good and bad. But there's also things that I think we all instinctively, collectively agree are bad, in most cases. Psychology, right? Your understanding of, kind of how human minds work. And other people, obviously, right? People you interact with are gonna affect what, you might think that stealing is wrong, but your friends might be like, listen, if it's like a tiny thing, it's really not that big a deal, and that might influence your morality on that. And then, of course, philosophy, which we talked about at length. Your energy and abilities also impact your perception of reality. When you're overworked, tired, drained, distracted, or hyper-focused, everything might seem like the hardest chore in the world. Like when you're having a really long week, you feel terrible, and it comes time for dinner, and you're like, I have to make a sandwich. And the process of making a sandwich seems like the most impossible task that has ever been presented to you. And you're like, I cannot physically stand up from this bed and put 2 pieces of bread and some cheese and some ham together, or I will cry. And then you end up door dashing food. You're a bit overworked, right? Everything seems very, very difficult. As opposed to when you're energized, right? You can prioritize, multitask, you're rested, you have a work-life balance. Things feel a lot easier, you might be more productive, right? And you're suddenly like, I have time to meal prep for the week, as opposed to feeling like sandwich time. It's horrible. Disabilities, right? They can limit where you go. Not everything is accessible to people who have certain disabilities. There are adjustments that need to be made for you to be able to kind of operate within society. That said, it can enhance your abilities, right? For example, people who are blind tend to have better hearing. And certain jobs and skills you obviously can't do because you don't have certain requirements kind of needed to complete it in a way that's safe. That said, disabilities can also come with abilities, right? I think I've mentioned before, I have ADHD. So when I hyper-focus, everything's great and wonderful because it makes me feel very productive. When I'm having a really bad day where I'm just distracted by everything and I forget things mid-sentence, it's really frustrating because then I'm like, oh my God, I can't function like a proper human being or get anything done. In terms of abilities, right, your education level aids in that. The higher your education level is on in a certain topic, the more skilled you can be, and at least influences how much you get paid for a job. Your hobbies, right, if you're really, really good at something, that can obviously help you develop things like special skills. But then you can apply those special skills. Don't even have to be anything super complex. For example, if you're just really good at being persuasive, because you're a very good communicator, that's a good skill to have. If you're a very organized person, that's also a very good skill to have for like most jobs. And then seeing your disabilities as abilities. Media, movies and TV. Again, back to this, right? In terms of pacing, right? Time moves a lot faster in movies than it does in real life. So events either feel rushed or we're skipping over the boring parts to make everything seem more exciting. Nobody wants to sit there and watch a movie where somebody just sits in traffic in complete silence. Should be pretty boring. But then it also, in terms of like feeling rushed, right? A lot of romantic comedies are very bad about that. Right? It'll be like you've given us no timeline of how long these people have known each other. So for us, it's like you've known each other for 2 days and you're getting married tomorrow. That's insane. Y'all need to slow down. Relationship expectations, right? It glorifies toxic relationships. YA is particularly notorious for that. Anything that was a Wattpad book that became a movie, notoriously bad for that. It's kind of like, hey, here's this guy who's an alcoholic and he treats you terribly, but like he's just sad inside and you should like tolerate that and then he'll love you. Don't do it as advice for life. And it's like, my love will change you. It will not. Step away from the toxic guy. My side note every time I talk about this is that when I found out of those after movies were fanfic about Harry Styles, I was like, if I was Harry Styles, I would feel so offended if somebody thinks that's how I behave. I would not like it. Beyond that, right, it's like Hollywood romances, right? Oh, somebody's gonna run through the airport when I'm gonna move countries and stop me and tell me that they love me. It's not gonna happen. You kind of have to adjust your expectations there. Unrealistic expectations, for example, money is really a concern. So, you'll have a story where it's like, I'm a writer who lives in New York, and here's my giant apartment. And it's like, you get paid like 75 cents a day. There's no way you can afford to live there, but hey, it's nice, fictitious Hollywood land where we can all afford, apartments. Often when it is a concern, it glorifies illegal ways of obtaining it, right? Get rich quick schemes, that's kind of the entire plot of the movie is, oh my God, we have to pay rent, how are we gonna do this? And it's kind of ridiculous plot to go along with it. Lies and deception, oftentimes behavior we consider unacceptable is accepted for the sake of entertainment, right? Again, harping on, romantic comedies. In the real world, most of us, if we have a misunderstanding with somebody, we'll just ask them. But that's not entertaining. So it's a lot more entertaining to see two people do the cliche thing where there's an obvious misunderstanding and then they just run away and have to stop them at the airport to be like, you don't understand what happened. It's not silly. And then mood and emotions, right? They can play with our minds. If you watch a romantic comedy, you might leave, feeling all lovey-dovey and happy. If you watch a scary movie, you're probably going to be freaked out for the rest of the day if it was a good one. So it does affect our emotions. Beyond that, things like taboos, what is appropriate or acceptable varies by culture. So for example, public nudity is more acceptable in certain cultures than in others. So, there's places like Denmark, where nudity is so common that nobody kind of bats an eye if they see another person naked. There's other cultures where, it's a lot more conservative and it's just like, why are you not wearing pants right now? I don't know you like that. There are times exploited or pushed back upon for effect. So for example, things like addiction, sex, and menstruation, are kind of treated either to get you to have a reaction to it, a negative reaction, right? There's the worst parts of like having an addiction, or like here's why it's gross to have your period, even though it's completely normal. They often become topics of social justice debate, right? Things like abortion are very taboo. They're usually things that it's like you don't tell anybody if you've had one, but then people are trying to, of course, normalize it. So we can have these conversations and healthier conversations about it. They can become normalized through media. So, for example, the LGBTQ community and topics of mental health have been normalized, right? Because we have more representation about it. We have a better understanding, and we can be like, okay, this is how this actually functions in the real world. Or there are certain things that are more acceptable in fantasy. So, for example, Game of Thrones, famous for a ton of incest that in normal everyday life would be like, what do you mean you're sleeping with your brother? But in fiction, we're like, it's still weird, but it's not real. So it's like less disgusting. And it can change through time, right? Back in the day, it was like impolite to talk about money. You shouldn't ask people how much money they make or anything like that. Nowadays, there's kind of a push to, for example, ask your coworkers. So you make sure you're not getting wildly underpaid for doing the same work as your coworkers. Profanity, so curse words, right? I mean, it always happens in the classroom. Somebody will say something and they're like, "Oh my God," and I'm like, "I don't care." We hear these words all the time, right? But we do live in a culture where it's still kind of like, oh, it's inappropriate for you to say, bad words in front of adults, your elders. So usually I'm like, it's perfectly fine. It's a word as long as you're not insulting anybody else you're trying to use it. And then subcultures, right? So in groups versus out groups. They are defined by interest, aesthetics, standards, /expectations, and gatekeeping. So subcultures can be positive in the sense that, it kind of gives you a place to belong through shared interest, but they can also kind of get a little bit toxic when people are like, oh, well, this person's not a real goth because they don't dress a certain way or they don't listen to a certain music. And so that gets a little weird there. Stereotypes and associations, so they can be negative or positive. There's subcultures that are seen more positively. So, hippies are just kind of like, oh yeah, they were just like chill stoners who were just, they just loved everybody. Versus punks being seen as kind of destructive and aggressive, uneducated. Personal versus group mentality, right? We can challenge personal views if not in accordance with group views, which we talked about, right? That whole group thing, kind of herd mentality notion. And then evolving, you can change through the years, or a person might age out of a group, right? You might have had interest when you were younger in a particular TV show, and you just aren't really that into it anymore. And so you kind of grow apart from the people that you shared that with. Maybe you were religious before, but you're not anymore, so you don't really associate with people from maybe like a youth group you were a part of, just because you've changed throughout. Lastly, education and careers, right? These access to information. We kind of are in the notion of thinking that everybody has access to the internet 24/7, but there are still people who don't have smartphones or who don't have internet at home, etc. They don't really have the same access to the same information. Things such as first generation versus legacy students, right? There's students who are the first in their family to be going to college at all versus students who are, my entire family has gone to Harvard, so I'm going to Harvard because of that. Passion versus following your parents' footsteps or expectations, right? Sure, when you were making your decisions on what you were gonna study, this was something that factored into that, right? What do I actually care about? What are my parents saying I should do? What do other people think I should do? And how do I actually decide what's right for me? Do I go and get that art degree, or should I just be an engineer? Changes in major versus sticking to one from the start, right? There's people who kind of go in knowing what they want and they stick to that and they finish their 4 years because that is their one true passion. There's other people who are like, yeah, I think this is what I like. Then you get there, you take your first class and you're like, I hate this and I can't have 4 years of this, so I'm gonna go do something else. Or they take an elective course and that makes them change their minds. They're like, actually, I find this a lot more interesting. Safety net careers, right? Happens a lot to people who are artists, kind of like, okay, but like, what's your job in the meantime while you make it in case you don't make it? What are you gonna do if you're not, you don't become a very famous musician? Who has access to higher education and who doesn't and what affects this, right? So who actually gets to go to college? Is it easier for certain groups of people to go to university as opposed to others and why? Having money and influence obviously opens more doors. You're better connected, you can do a lot more things than people who don't have money. That's associated with privilege. Academic or skill handicaps, right? Some people, for example, are not the best test takers, so if they are studying something that's gonna have a ton of tests, they're not gonna do super well. Funding issues, right? People just can't afford to pay for higher education, it's pretty expensive. Then connections, nepotism, and networking, all of these then give you a little bit of a foot up. Generational cycles of poverty and low income jobs, right? A lot of people who just can't afford to go to college, so they just have to kind of just take over whatever. Their dad is a farmer or factory worker, and they just kind of keep doing that. High demand careers, right? So those that are constantly needing more people, versus careers that are hard to break into, like acting, for example. Who defines what qualifies as a useless degree? Right? A lot of times we tell people to study certain things, or like, what are you going to do with that? Like, what are the actual practical things that you can do with, I don't know, a degree in philosophy? And then glorification and judgment of careers, right? There's careers that we look at that we're like, wow, so impressive, and others that we kind of judge. So